Welcome to the Truth in the Public Square podcast, a podcast dedicated to equipping Christians to engage culture and politics for the glory of God and the common good. I'm your host, Harrison Lang, and on today's podcast, I am joined by Dr. Christopher Talbot to discuss Francis Schaeffer's cultural and political engagement. Christopher serves as assistant professor of ministry and apologetics at Welch College in Tennessee. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so delighted to have this conversation with you about an important figure in the 20th centuries for evangelicals. If you wouldn't mind updating the audience who might not be familiar with you about just a little bit of an introduction about you and also your current ministry settings.
Yeah. Again, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I work as like you said, the assistant professor of ministry and apologetics here at Welch College. I find myself at a little bit of like an interesting intersection. I am a program coordinator for youth and family ministry here at Welch. So the majority of my time here at Welch, I am training youth pastors, family pastors, people for like full-time ministry, but also have a really huge interest and a passion for apologetics as well. And so I did my PhD in apologetics and culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is not where I came to meet the work of Francis Schaeffer, but it's where I really dived a lot deeper. For those that don't know, the Schaeffer collection, a lot of his correspondence is actually at Southeastern Seminary. And so I just got really interested in Schaeffer. I've always had a really deep interest in apologetics, even from early on in my Christian life. I also serve as a associate pastor at a church in Nashville. And me and my wife, we have 3 boys, and we just had a baby girl about 4 months ago. So life is busy, but it's good, and we're very blessed.
Praise the Lord, yeah. Praise the Lord for your faithfulness and at Welch College, but also serving in local church ministry. That's one thing I've been really benefited as I've got connected with some leaders and professors and in Bible college and seminaries, is most of them are also serving as pastors in a local church, and to show how you can, as you train ministers, as you train just the next generation of whatever the Lord's going to call them, that you're also having that spiritual aspect that you're serving in the local church as well. For our listeners who may not be familiar, who was Francis Schaeffer? You've spoke about him a little bit, but who is he, and why has he had such a lasting influence on evangelical cultural and political engagement for us?
Yeah, great question. So some people may be familiar with Schaeffer. I imagine a lot of like younger listeners may not be as familiar. He passed away in 1984, and so it's been quite a while since his impact has been felt very vividly, like in our culture. Two major places where people might intersect with him or come to know him. One is he started a ministry called L'Abri over in Huemo, Switzerland, which was a kind of apologetic ministry. So it was held in a Swiss chalet, and people from all over the world would visit the chalet, and they had a motto there that they would have honest answers to honest questions. And so they had all sorts of people, drug addicts, people that had just recently read, Friedrich Nietzsche or Albert Camus or whoever it might be, pregnant mothers that would darken the doors of their home, and they would just spend the next days and weeks, maybe even months, sharing the gospel with them and answering the apologetic questions that they have. That led into a lot of Schaeffer's early writings. And so early books of his, like The God Who Is There, Escape from Reason, He Is There and He's Not Silent, and a few others as well, are really kind of the fruit of that early like apologetic ministry.
Mm-hmm.
So the apologetic side would be one portion of it. People also might hear his name as they research or dive into early talks of the pro-life movement. So Schaeffer was just about one of the earliest evangelicals to advocate for the right to life for the unborn. Interesting enough is even back then in like the late 70s, he was also arguing against euthanasia as well, which maybe wasn't as big then, but certainly we're feeling it now, like in our own culture. And so he really influenced guys like Jerry Falwell from Liberty University, founder of Liberty University, Tim LaHaye. People might be familiar with like the Left Behind series that he wrote. He did a lot of other works as well. There's a good chance that like some of your favorite thinkers were influenced from one degree to another by Schaeffer. And so while you might not know the name, his influence is still very much felt within like evangelicalism.
Yeah, he's had such a lasting impact on evangelicalism more than what most people realize. I
Yeah.
mean, I don't know if you've ever asked somebody in one of your classes, one of your students, but there's probably be majority of them probably haven't heard of Francis Schaeffer. Would be my guess.
Yeah, I think it'd be correct.
And definitely haven't read a book from him. Would be the majority of students, and you're at a very well respected institution. It's not like you're at a more just like wishy washy Bible college. You're at a legit academic at Christian institution, and just a lot of these well thoughtful Christians just haven't engaged with him. But the more and more I've read of Francis Schaeffer, the more and more relevant he is for today. It is so
Mhm.
crazy how it seems like he was so ahead of the time. So when it comes to the apologetic aspect of his writing ministry, there's so much of those philosophical questions that we're still asking today, and that he already has the answers from 50 years ago. And
Yeah.
then even when it comes to the cultural engagement side, especially towards the latter time of his ministry, he still is very pertinent for the way that we can think about Christianity, culture, and politics. And along those lines, one of his most famous books, How Shall We Then Live? He makes the argument of how we should view worldview and also culture. What is he arguing in that book? How can we evaluate it? And then what could that mean for us today?
Yeah. So how should we then live? Which also you could probably see a decent amount of overlap with like the God Who Is There and a
Mhm.
few of his other books as well. I think one of the things that Schaeffer got right and cared a lot about was the idea that one, that ideas have consequences,
Mhm.
right? So if a philosopher starts to promote an idea and that gets picked up by other people and people subscribe to that, that's going to change the way that culture like thinks about things. And so ideas aren't just this thing kind of up in the ether that we deal with in the abstract, but they a lot of times ideas have feet on the ground, right? And so they affect the way in which we do things. And very similar to that, I think he would talk about like the importance of worldviews as well. And so while he didn't, I don't know that he actually ever uses the word postmodernism. That is really kind of threaded through a lot of his work. This idea that if you reject truth, if you reject moral absolutes, if you reject the existence of God, right, the absolute absolute, that there are not only like theological implications, but there's cultural implications for that as well, right? So if we reject the very basis of like reality and truth, that like we should not be surprised when like the culture crumbles around us. And so I think he touched on it early on. So how should we then live is just his way of tracing his way through all this in Western culture. So he goes all the way back and just kind of walks his way through important thinkers. I don't know that he always gets every figure exactly right.
Mhm.
I don't know who does, but
Yeah.
I think he gets the. One of my friends puts it this way: he's a little bit like an impressionist painter. And so while you might not be able to make out all the exact details, it's lily pads, right? And like what the picture is. And so he gets the broad strokes right, and I'm really thankful for that.
You mentioned at the beginning that he spoke about how ideas have consequences.
Hmm.
And I think that as we evaluate the culture before us as Christian conservatives, we definitely have recognized that there are some ideas that have some severe consequences on both sides of the aisle, by the way. It's not just
Yeah.
a left thing, it's also, we can see it's an issue on the right. And we see that, I mean, most pertinently, I think most recently, is the Epstein files. We see people on both sides of the aisles that are both having the most corrupt, evil, and wickedness with the relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. What would be some ideas that he points out in the book that are still pertinent to us today from what you recall? And is there anything else that you would add that you say, hey, this is still an issue that we can learn from the way that Francis Schaeffer evaluated this idea and its consequences?
Yeah. There's two that come to mind right away that I think are still really pertinent. I think one of the reasons Schaeffer was so influential when he was, and we still feel a little bit of his influence nowadays, is because he really does tap into the problems of what we now call postmodernism. He, from the get go, early on in his ministry, is really convictional, not only about just truth generally, but about like the inerrant truth of Scripture, like objectively. And so he holds to that. That runs throughout the gamut of his writings. That we can't just say like it's theologically true, but not like actually true. And so he's constantly defending the truth of Scripture, but also just the truth of like God's existence as well. So touching on postmodernism, his idea of like you can't something can't be true and not true at the same time. He calls it the antithesis, right? Um, and then also maybe not as significant, but I think he really touches on the problems of like neo-orthodox and
Mm.
liberal theology as well. He's quick to point out like the problems of like Karl Barth's neo-orthodoxy. Your listeners might not, if even if they are familiar with Schaeffer, they might not know that him and Karl Barth actually met one another. Schaeffer went and met him at his home in Zurich, I think. And Schaeffer was going to present a paper on Barth's theology, and just want to make sure they got him right. Like he disagreed with him, and he said that, but he said, "I want to make sure that I'm representing you fairly," which I think is the right thing to do. And you can actually Google it. Bart writes a letter back to him. You can find the letter online pretty easily, and he really tears like Schaeffer apart. He's really upset by the whole like interaction. That said, I actually think Schaeffer's right. I think he's concerned about you're using all this historically orthodox language, but you actually mean something entirely different, right? Which kind of finds its way back to that whole idea of like, is something true or is it not, right? Like we can play language games, but at the end of the day, like it has to be true within the worldview and it has to be true to reality. And I think Schaeffer gets both of those things really right.
And to connect that, talking about post-modernity and the way that he's kind of a precursor and has evaluated it, kind of the foundation before, as we've coined post-modernity today. He was kind of on top of that. He's commonly spoke about the line of despair,
Mm-hmm.
where even at the intellectual level, there was this rejection of I'm trying to think of the proper word to say here. There's no absolutes. There's no
Right.
there's no truth. It's just chaotic and all irrational and absurd. What would be some things that you can encourage the listeners as they're raising their kids in a culture that is in the line of despair? How can
Mm-hmm.
we prepare the next generation to live in a culture that's in the line of despair? And how can we, by God's grace, hopefully one day not be a nation that has pervasive lawlessness, pervasive just moral decadence?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Um, I I should have mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that Schaeffer also does really well is what we might call cultural apologetics,
Mhm.
and really like not to like overstate my case here, but I think most of the people that are doing what we would call cultural apologetics, like looking at cultural artifacts and cultural trends, and then doing apologetics from that, I don't know that you really have that except through Schaeffer. So I think he's massively influential when it comes to that. So I would encourage parents to do a little bit of what Schaefer does. Look at the music that's being played. Look at the TV shows that are being watched in movies. It doesn't mean you actually have to watch all of them, but analyze them from like a Christian worldview, and teach your kids how to analyze them.
Mhm.
I think this is one of the things that Schaefer does like really he's really helpful with this because he points out that it's not just the philosophers that are struggling to make sense of like absolute truth and um, moral objectivity and things like that, but it's the musicians and it's the artist and it's the general culture. It's the Beatles, it's like it's everybody during that time, and he gives these really concrete examples. John Cage and Salvador Dali and Pablo Picasso, people that you may be familiar with. And so just being able to point those out. But then on top of that, so if all we do is just analyze and critique, then we become knowledgeable, but we don't actually improve society.
Mhm.
And so I would just want to encourage people to take one step further, and then try to like promote healing in the culture. Schaeffer calls this substantial healing. He doesn't think that we're going to like make a perfect culture. He doesn't think we're going to bring about like the eschaton. He's not a post millennialist actually,
Mhm.
but he does think that we can contribute to some actual substantive change in our culture. And so if we make good art and we make good music and we educate our kids well and we're participating in politics in the right way, then we can actually see some change happen.
One thing that I thought about when you mentioned about analyzing a culture from a Christian worldview. That's one thing I've always been so benefited by from Francis Schaeffer. That's one thing that probably first drew me in. The philosophy side as well, because I found that I was asking all the questions that he was asking, which I think is partially encouraging as a Christian when you feel that way. When you feel like,
Yeah.
hey, I'm not the only one that's struggled with just the problem of being and just the problem of life and just wrestling with these uh, problems of existence that we live in, especially in a fallen world. And I think it's really helpful. But one thing that made me think about is you talked about how it's not just the philosophers, it's not just the academics who are providing these thoughts about life and way that we should think about the world. I mean, I think it was a year ago in January we lost President Jimmy Carter. And if you recall, what song did they play at his funeral that had some people questioning why did they play it? Imagine by John Lennon.
Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, if you listen to that song, you cannot neglect to hear what has influenced John Lennon, and
Yeah.
and it's influencing his listeners. And so I think that's a very helpful exercise you just mentioned with for parents, especially for parents as they want to disciple their children to, hey, what are you listening to, and like, hey, what you're listening to is going to affect you. And if you know, and
Right.
so it's kind of good to have that initial ears for all of us. So even as an adult, as I need to be careful what I'm listening to and what I'm consuming, and to see if it's actually going to be helpful for my mind and my soul. Moving forward, we've talked about a little bit, but how did Francis Schaeffer connect philosophy, art, theology when diagnosing the cultural decline around him in the 20th century?
Yeah. So you probably see this most clearly in his book, The God Who Is There.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier about students not reading a whole lot of Schaeffer. My personal mission here at Welch College is to make sure all my students read Schaeffer. So I assign a little, at least a little bit here and there. But he calls it these steps below the line of despair. And so I think it begins with philosophy and it ends with theology. Whether or not like that's actually the way that cultural change happens, I think is a little bit that doesn't matter as much as he would say these things are interconnected, right? What philosophers teach and think about, and what musicians write about, and what artists paint and make, and what theologians do, like those aren't. He's making a good point to say that like those aren't all just like housed off in their own separate areas. Like they're interconnected, and so if you have like existentialism and postmodernism and post-structuralism and stuff like that, it's going to trickle down into art and paintings and sculptures and music and in the wider culture as well. And so yeah, just I think realizing that uh, that there is this shift that's happening. He was right to go to the philosophers first, I think, because that's the most clear statement. Even though sometimes philosophers aren't always super clear, it's the most clear statement of an idea, and then you see that idea expressed in cultural artifacts. And so I think his idea to say, hey, when you see the culture shifting, it's going below this line of despair, which really what he means by that is they're rejecting absolute truth when they go below the line of despair. Well, when you see it in philosophy first, don't be surprised when you then see it in these other areas as well. And he essentially makes a case too, like you'll be sure that it'll find its way into theology one way or another as well, whether that's liberal theology or neo-orthodox or something like that.
Some of our listeners may be asking themselves, okay, so I can see the connection here. I can see how this line of despair has led to our current moment in 21st century America, and especially in the West as well. They may be asking, why do we need to understand the history of ideas in order to faithfully engage society? So my question for you is, why is it important to understand the history of ideas as we engage society faithfully? And also,
Yeah.
what would be some insights from Francis Schaeffer as well that could help us as we engage culture and society around us?
Yeah. I feel like I'm kind of putting on. I don't teach history here, but I'm going to bat for my our history professor. Is that like if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat it, right?
Hmm.
If you want to know like how we got there, we kind of have to figure out like where we've been. And
Hmm.
so I think looking at a history of ideas, whether you're reading Schaeffer or somebody else that does this, all you're doing is you're going like upstream of our cultural moment, and you're looking at like what are the various like tributaries and streams and ideas and thoughts that have like poured into this flow of ideas that we're in right now. because we didn't just wake up yesterday. We didn't just randomly find ourselves in this cultural moment. It's the progression, it's the cumulative effect of a lot of ideas, a lot of worldviews, a lot of artifacts, all that stuff that Schaeffer talks about that have led to our particular moment. And so, I think going back, and then I mean, it's a little bit like doing like medicine work, right? Like you want to diagnose the problem, and so sure, I can see maybe some symptoms, but we might have to actually figure out like what's the actual disease, and if we're doing that we have to go farther back, right?
Hmm.
And so we a lot of times culturally we are very reactionary to the symptoms of the culture, and we don't know what the actual disease of the culture is.
Hmm.
And I think again Schaeffer is instrumental in helping us diagnose our cultural problems.
You just mentioned the word reactionary, that we can be typically very reactionary when we see it comes from both sides of the aisle, where that there's the left side will react to anything the right does, the right reacts anything to the left. And I had a conversation with John Wilsey about 2 months ago, and
Mhm.
his most recent book on religious freedom, a conservative primer or primer. I heard
Mhm.
there was a discussion of how to actually pronounce it. I don't know if I've been saying it wrong or not, but anyways, he mentions a lot about there's these reactionary figures in the conservative side in history and in today, and I definitely do see that. And there's a lot of sympathies I think that we can have with the reactionaries and the more right wing side, because the left has lost their mind. There's legit mutilizing children, and there's
Sure.
legit
Yeah.
things going on that on the left side that are just totally irreprehensible. And I'm sure Francis Schaeffer has had a good eye actually on seeing the ultimate end. It's the more and more you read of him, the more you're like, wow, he probably wouldn't be too surprised what's going on in our culture today. All that being said, how can conservatives not become reactionaries? What would be
Yeah.
your encouragement to, as I see in this pervasive culture, what would be especially for young conservatives, because this is where there's a lot of reactionary undertones in people's political theology.
Yeah. The by the way, this is an excellent question, and I think this question right here really gets to the heart of like so much of our disagreements
Yep.
and our difficulties as we try to do like cultural engagement. Um, so two things real quick. One, uh, just because we're not trying to be reactionary, which what I would just mean by that is simply something happens, we want to like quickly like respond, or we react rather than being intentional. I don't think Schaeffer or the Bible, to just be blunt about it, would ever say we should turn like a blind eye to like cultural evils, like you're saying, like the evils of like of transgenderism, of abortion, of euthanasia, so many of these different things. So and Schaeffer didn't, right? He calls out, and I'd love to talk to more about this here in just a second, but he calls out abortion in the late 70s, not too long after Roe v. Wade, one of the first evangelicals to do it. He's calling out euthanasia. He calls out pollution in like 1971. He's like literally like the only evangelical, uh, conservative Bible believing evangelical to call for like the care of creation. But even back in like the 1940s, in the middle of World War II, he writes a pamphlet arguing against anti-Semitism. And in the middle of the 40s, he is also pastoring a church and telling them, if you make a black person feel unwelcome in St. Louis, then if you make a black person feel unwelcome, I'll resign that very day. So he's just really consistently like um, courageous and ready for like the cultural moment. But I don't know that he was. I think he reacted in as much as when a issue came up, he responded to it. But I don't know that he was like reactionary, right? And so maybe that's helpful on it. Um, the other thing too is I just want to encourage Christians to have a like a hopeful confidence. So we don't turn a blind eye. We address things courageously and confidently, while also realizing that we know how like everything turns out in the end, right? And so I like to tell my students, we don't have a theology of panic, right? We don't believe in like panic theology. We have a hopeful theology because we know Christ is Lord. Schaeffer would say the same thing. Schaeffer, I'm trying to remember the story, so hopefully I don't butcher this too much, but I think he was asked a question of something like, it feels like as Christians we're in the 10th round and we're bloodied and we feel like we're about to quit. What should we do? And Schaeffer says something like, and hopefully I'm not butchering the story here, but he says something like, if we're trying to win as Christians out of our own ability, we've already lost. He says we have to do the Lord's work in the Lord's way, which I think is just a really wonderful word. So he's not saying turn a blind eye, right? Don't do that. But we have to make sure to honor the Lord as holy. We have to um, uh, uh, treat Christ as Lord over all things, right? We care for people made in the image of God. We ground all of our cultural work in the Bible, not in anything else. And so I think he's a good example in these ways.
You just mentioned a couple moments ago about Francis Schaeffer being one of the first evangelicals to fight against abortion and being
Hmm.
pro-life. Why was it such a decisive moment in evangelical history for Francis Schaeffer to step up and to fight for life?
Yeah, that's a good question. At least at that moment, and there's been some good histories. I don't want to oversimplify it, but for the most part, this was largely like a Catholic issue.
Hmm.
So Catholics ha- largely got this right that like even in the womb, a person is a person, right? That's a new life. Famously or infamously, really, W.A. Criswell, I think he later changed his mind about this. But around that time, he was pro choice and he was president of the Southern Baptist Convention during the time and essentially like argued that others should be pro choice as well. Well, like I said, he changes his mind later on. But Schaefer seemed, for whatever reason, to get it. He seemed to like connect the dots. And what I find so prescient is it's not just abortion at the time, but if you do kind of a search and find of his works, that almost every time where he talks about abortion, he's also talking about the evils of infanticide
Hmm.
and euthanasia at the same time. And so the killing of the newly born and killing of the elderly.
Hmm.
And again, rightfully so, he grounds this in a right understanding of people made in the image of God, right? That people have a worth, whether they're in the womb, whether they're near the end of life, no matter what it is, they have dignity and worth. And so that's a theological and biblical conviction that he has there.
Moving forward to as we think about, okay, this is a crime, this is a sin, this is wrong, abortion, right?
Hmm.
How did he understand and how can we understand the relationship between biblical morality and civil law? How can we think about issues that whether the state should get into when something perhaps might be wrong and sinful? How can we navigate that question of when a sin becomes a crime?
Yeah. So he's probably most clear in his views on this in his book, A Christian Manifesto.
Hmm.
One of his later books, probably one of his most polemical books. He's a little bit takes the gloves off a little bit in it. That's made some people love it and some people hate it, and so maybe just be prepared as you read through that. Schaeffer would say very simply that the law, Lex Rex, right, Samuel Rutherford, the law is king, but that the law needs to be grounded in a biblical morality. Now he's a little ambiguous as to like what he fully means by that. Not to get too much in the weeds, but some people take him to then be like a theonomist of some kind, and he's not that, right? He doesn't think that we need to apply like Old Testament laws to like the United States. And I could talk more about that if you want me to. That said, he would say like if we don't ground our civil laws uh, in a biblical morality. And I think what he means by that is like the natural law that God has given to us that's revealed like in the Ten Commandments, in nature, that comes from God Himself. Then if we don't have that, then mankind makes up its own morality. And if mankind makes up its own morality, then all of a sudden the whole framework, foundation, and structure of society starts to fall apart, right? And so he's really adamant, especially in a Christian manifesto, to say like our morality can't be, it can't just be like social contract, right? It can't just be us like agreeing upon something or us making up our own laws, but it has to be something objective to us to be a good law. Yeah, yeah,
You mentioned the topic of theonomy, which I think would be a
yeah.
helpful conversation of explaining what exactly is a theonomy and why did Francis Schaeffer, although he was slightly before a lot of the Reconstructionists and Theonomists
Yeah.
in the 80s and 90s. But wouldn't mind explaining for the audience what is Theonomy and why did Francis Schaeffer reject it and why should we also reject it today?
Yeah, yeah. So I want to be a little careful here,
Yeah.
because I don't want somebody to hear this that is a theonomist and say that I'm misrepresenting them. Um, I'm thinking largely of like R.J. Rushdoony,
Hmm.
pretty influential Reconstructionist theonomist. It's just the idea that some of, if not a lot of, the Old Testament laws have bearing upon
Hmm.
like our American judicial system today, and so that we're to take like these Levitical laws, not all of them, right? Like I don't know that we're uh, taking every all 650, 700 laws, but some of them, and then applying them to this. One of the major reasons I don't think Schaeffer is that because Gary North, R.J. Rushdoony's son-in-law, didn't think that Schaeffer was a theonomist, and so he didn't think that Schaeffer went far enough on some of these issues. So I, but part of the reason people think that Schaeffer was a bit of a theonomist is that some of his citations in a Christian Manifesto were taken from theonomists. But just because someone cites someone doesn't mean that they like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's not like a full throat endorsement on those things. Yeah, I think he just would have had a much more what I would consider kind of a historically reformed view of like applying biblical morality to the state. Yeah,
Well, I think that's really helpful. Again, I think that we can learn so much from some theonomists. They get some things right,
sure,
and then like it's always a spectrum. There will be people from every part of understanding cultural political engagement as Christians, and especially when it comes to I don't want to get too much into it, but obviously the relationship with the covenants in the Old New Testaments.
right.
There's going to be some people that get things right, some things wrong. I think, if you believe that Christ is Lord and you really believe in the gospel and you're a Christian, I can learn from you. And so it even thinks about, over the past, year or so, you see a lot of evangelicals critique Tim Keller's cultural and political engagement. And again, I think some of those critiques are warranted. I don't agree with everything with Tim Keller with how his views on cultural and political engagement. At the same time, I'm not going to discount his whole ministry, and it's the same thing for people on both sides of every conversation. So, like, I'm a big fan of Greg Bonson. I don't agree with everything Greg Bonson, but I find him really fascinating and helpful, especially to actually understand Cornelius Van Til.
Yeah.
But anyways, I think the last thing I want to talk about is Safer emphasized that the Christian life is all of life. It's total. It completely influences every part of our being. And I think that most Christians know that, but they don't fully comprehend it. What
Yeah.
would be some helpful things that Schaeffer encouraged Christians to understand the call as a Christian, how it changed their entire life, and what would be some things that you would add to the 21st century listener?
Yeah. Um, I would actually take like maybe one step back on this. Well, one of the reasons Schaeffer thinks that Christianity is true for all of life is that he had a bit of a spiritual crisis in like the 1950s, early 1950s. He calls it his hayloft experience. And he comes out of that. He goes into it doubting Christianity, not sure if it's actually true. Comes out of it not only believing Christianity is true, but he says true for all of life. And so, actually, maybe one of the first things to do, if you haven't read anything by Schaeffer, is to read True Spirituality. I think sometimes we jump over spirituality to get to like cultural engagement and like the lordship of Christ and things like that. But Schaeffer rightly says like, well, no, day by day, moment by moment dependence upon the Lord Jesus Christ is fundamental to understanding the lordship of Christ in every area of life, right? So it's not this separation of like spirituality over here and lordship over here, but he sees those to be actually deeply intertwined with one another. He said that he's interested in a particular kind of evangelism that leads into the lordship of life for all of life. And so you see this even with his books, that he starts off with some apologetic books, which are kind of like the entryway, right? Like into like the Christian life. Let's defend uh, the Christian faith. But then you have books about environmental care, and then you have books about psychology and about art, exegetical studies, books about government, right? Whatever happened to the human race, a Christian manifesto. but also about like the church, uh, the church before the watching world, and
Mm.
the Great Evangelical Disaster, which is his final book. And so, yeah, I think just trying to think, if Christ is Lord, if what He's giving to me in His Word is uh, absolutely true, like it's without error, then as a faithful believer, like I don't have to be like housed off into like my own kind of Christian commune or something like that, but rather I have the freedom in the Lord to like to take my spiritual gifts and my Christian faith and go into like every area of culture. I might not change the world, you know, as it were, but I can participate in some redemptive healing wherever God places me. And so I just think that that idea of like all of life, um, it's not just what we do on Sunday, right? It's like Monday through Saturday as well. And so just every facet of society. I know you mentioned even before we started recording about politics, right? Like and not just big politics, like working as like part of your local your local politics as well, and community boards and things like that. That's a way to live out like Christianity in all of life is doing those kind of things.
Well, and I always say it. I think that regenerated Christians, Christians who are indwelt by the Spirit, if Christians who are true believers, who are being sanctified by His grace, are the best citizens. And it's
Yeah,
not that it's a sense of anything in our own doing that we are in being prideful that hey, Christians are so great, therefore we should run in everything, but because Christianity is true, and coming
yeah,
from that presupposition, and our worldview would obviously be most consistent with reality because we believe that our faith is reality.
right,
And so when Christians step up in their local and state levels, because that's where you can, I mean,
right,
I'm sure there's someone in your church that could, if they wanted to, have a chance to be a school board member,
right.
to be maybe a state legislator, even, and those are real possibilities for people that and there's the ones that are going to be. I mean, even Tennessee today, they shelved a bill for abolition of abortion, and so there's of course like political ramifications of this, be a big uproar. But obviously, we desire for pretty much everything in that bill to be passed.
Right.
I'm an incrementalist personally. I don't know what you are, but
Yeah, yeah.
we still like people that represent you allowed that bill to be shut down, and you could be the person or help that person who would help abortion be abolished to help meet the needs of people in your communities. You could help elect that person, or you could be that person to be elected. The last thing, what would be some other social responsibilities that you think Schaeffer would encourage the church to do? Think of the church corporately at your local church in Tennessee, and then also think individually. Think about the oil mechanic, the stay at home mom, the math teacher. What would be something that you would encourage them to help meet the needs of people in their society?
Yeah. Real obvious ones. I think he even mentions this in a Christian manifesto, is whether or not we're involved in politics. Shaver says you should be involved in like local crisis pregnancy
Hmm.
centers. In some ways, that's kind of like low hanging fruit, right? Like be raising money, do like a diaper drive. I mean, there's just like really tangible things to help out young mothers that might be in like crisis pregnancies, and what a wonderful way in which the church to help. Um, I think, I mean, one of the things I find so compelling about Schaeffer, and you don't always get this in reading his books, but you do as you read the biographies, is he had such a compelling understanding of people's inherent worth.
Mm.
And so there's all sorts of stories about how he'd be late to meet with like a dignitary because he was sharing the gospel with like a janitor or a cab driver, you know, or someone like that. And so, I mean, honestly, one of the things I want to be careful of, I teach classes on Christianity, culture, and worldview, and so I love talking about cultural engagement. But there is a social responsibility to share the truth of the gospel, right, and to actually communicate it with individuals. So I think that's big too. I think, um, oh yeah, I mean, I think a good one for us right now, just as like an extrapolation of like what he's talked about, is caring for the disabled. I think that that'd be a wonderful ministry for a lot of churches to start disability ministries, help people in that way as well. I think again, I'm going off of memory here, but I think it wasn't ran by Labrie, but there was a nearby chalet by Labrie workers had worked with Schaeffer that started a home for kids with cerebral palsy there in the Swiss Alps, and so that was like very close to what they were doing. Yeah, I think not to just keep going on about it, but he would say like think about your basic relationships, right? Like how can you redeem your interactions between other individuals, right? So fight
Mhm.
against racism. How might you heal your relationship with God's created order? And so do like a we're not talking about like radical environmentalism, but like evangelical like care of creation, right? We don't want to destroy the world that God has made, right? At just a very basic level. Um,
And may I interrupt you there?
yeah,
I
yeah,
think a
please do.
lot of Christian conservatives would be like, "Oh, you have been bought out by George Soros,
Right.
and you have you're completely woke. You're no longer conservative." And I would first respond to people of that circle being like, "Hey, there are people who have been influenced by that who are in the wrong. So there are
Sure,
people who would be more moderates who are, caring for climate change with, because again, the climate change issue is way more complex than just.
sure.
I mean, firstly, pollution is a reality.
Yeah,
You can't get around that. The two variables are firstly, what are we going to do about it? That's a big conversation. I think a lot of people on the left have no valid response. I agree generally more with the more conservative way to respond there, but also it comes down to like, hey, like yeah, there we do have a responsibility as image bearers. It's in
yeah.
the first three chapters of Genesis that we are to work and keep the earth,
Right,
and
right.
that's something that we cannot neglect. And so I just get really like sick and tired of when some conservatives get mad at some other Christians
Yeah,
who do have some desire for, creation care, which again, that you can think that's a corny name. I don't care, but
sure.
like,
Yeah,
and so it's just an important thing to mention that Francis Schaeffer, who by no means you could not consider a liberal or
yeah,
influenced at all by
yeah.
any sort of um, thing of
People,
the modern Democratic Party. So it is really,
yeah,
I'm really happy that you mentioned that again.
yeah.
Like, not saying that you have to make sure that everything's recycled and get down to one trash bag a year. That's
Right,
not what we're
right,
saying. But we are saying is that hey, there is responsibility. Let's not be neglectful, and let's
right.
say hey, there are responsibilities that we have as image bearers, as a collective group, as the United States to take care of that. And again,
Yeah,
it's not just to go hey, let's only go to green energy tomorrow.
right.
But let's work towards and put investments in there that are smart, reliable, and not just
Yes.
doing anything and everything just because it's what's politically correct of the day.
No, that's exactly right. And again, Schaeffer's writing about caring for God's creation, and like I think it's 1971 that he writes "Pollution: The Death of Man."
Hmm.
So this is, I mean, years ago, right? Yeah, no, to be sure. And I think a good like guideline here too is we don't put creation over image bearers, right? And I think oftentimes that's where like radical environmentalism goes wrong. Is it essentially says, well, it doesn't matter what happens to mankind so long as we save like the oceans and the trees and all that stuff. Well, no, of course not, right? Like mankind is the pinnacle of God's creation, and so
Hmm.
we want to have a rightly ordered view of creation. Which again, like I think Schaeffer's really clear about that. I would encourage listeners to go read "Pollution: The Death of Man." See if they disagree with anything there, because that's all that I mean when I'm talking
Hmm.
about
Yep.
caring for creation is what Schaeffer talks about in that book. Yeah,
Well, I even recently saw a tweet, with all the goods and all the negatives of Twitter or X
yeah,
now, formerly Twitter. I saw someone post. It was actually by someone that's like, I'm a huge Theodore Roosevelt fan. That's my favorite president. And so I like following some account, and basically they retweeted it. But someone said like, I'm not, I'm like the Theodore Roosevelt kind of conservationist, not the tree hugging liberal conservationist. And so I think that's a really helpful way. Like, think Theodore Roosevelt when you think about
right.
Francis Schaeffer, when you're thinking about, not everything, but when you think about for his idea of conserving what the Lord has entrusted with us. And I think that's very
Yeah,
helpful. And so is there any other closing comments that you would have encouraging folks about Francis Schaeffer and about cultural and political engagement?
yeah. I mean, I my kind of personal mission right now is to just get more people to read Schaeffer. I'd love to see kind of a renewal of his thought.
Mhm.
there's some pockets still with people like that that still really enjoy Schaeffer, and I'm thankful to hear that you've read some of his work. But if they're looking for a place to start, I think books like True Spirituality are a really good place. There's a really tiny book called Two Contents, Two Realities,
Hmm.
that if you just want to get an idea of like what Schaeffer's all about,
Hmm.
that's a really good starting point, because he talks about the beauty of human relationships. So there's the compassion part of it, as well as the importance of sound doctrine as well. So Schaeffer, to me, just he balances so well conviction and compassion, that we don't move an inch on the inerrancy of Scripture, and yet we care for people wherever we find them. And so that this is he's a wonderful example to follow, and I hope more people read him.
I agree. He's been such a blessing in my life as I've thought about the deep things of existence, theology, philosophy, art. Even I did not care about art until I read Francis Schaeffer, honestly, and it's been really grateful for that. In addition, I'm very grateful for you, Chris, for joining me on the podcast today, and so thankfully you took time of your day.
Yeah, thanks for having me.